emergency rental assistance program. Steps like self-attestation and bulk utility payments have been very helpful to Rhode Islanders trying to get these returns. One area, though, is very difficult, and it always seems difficult. That is the homeless population. Okay, can you look at and try to develop the ERA guidelines to emphasize how funds can be appropriately used for homelessness?
That's an extremely important area. We're very focused on it, and we'll be happy to work with you on it. What I can say is that ERA funds can be used to provide so-called housing stability services, a range of services to the homeless to help them find a stable shelter. Something that Treasury did, a kind of flexibility that we built into our guidelines, is ERA statute requires that to be eligible for assistance, a household has to have a so-called rental obligation. Recognizing that would be something that would be challenging for families experiencing homelessness, we created an opportunity for ERA grantees to provide individuals with a letter of intent to pay a rental obligation. So with this letter of intent, that would make it easier for the homeless to be able to secure housing. So those are two forms of flexibility we think will help, and we'd be glad to work with you to see if we can identify more.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. And on communicating those provisions to local authorities would be helpful. And just a final point, Secretary Yellen, this is with the Homeowner Assistance Fund. I know you're looking at the state plans, and if you could accelerate that to get the money out, because as you well know, a lot of these moratoriums on eviction are either gone or going, and it would be very helpful to get the money out. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Reid. Senator Crapo of Idaho is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Yellen, some appear to believe that you have announced that unless a debt limit increase or suspension occurs before December 15th, that the Treasury faces imminent default. That's not how I've read your comments. So it would be helpful for you to clarify what your current projection is for when Treasury would run out of headroom to operate below the debt limit and run dangerously low of operating cash. I also request that Treasury provide details of its latest debt and cash projections to the Finance Committee, and look forward to receiving those projections.
Yes, let me clarify what I said. What I indicated in my most recent letter to Congress is that I have a high degree of confidence that Treasury will be able to finance the U.S. government through December 15th, but there would be scenarios in which Treasury would not have sufficient funds to continue to finance the operations of the U.S. government beyond that date. I would note that on December 15th, Treasury will invest funds from the infrastructure bill, and that will use up $118 billion worth of capacity when those funds are from the Highway Trust Fund are invested in government securities. And I didn't say that there is no way that we can make it past December 15th. There are a range, there's uncertainty about what our cash balance will be and our resources. Right now, there's uncertainty about where we will be on December 15th. And there are scenarios in which we can see it would not be possible to finance the government. That doesn't mean that there are not also scenarios in which we can, but we think it's important for Congress to recognize that we may not be able to, and therefore to raise the debt ceiling expeditiously.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for that clarification. Chair Powell, inflation hit 6.2% last month, which is the highest in more than 3 decades. Still, the administration is pushing for support of a nearly $2 trillion social spending package. And by the way, that number even accepts their budget gimmicks that hide real costs that could mean several trillion more in spending over the next 10 years. Most of that spending does nothing to ameliorate the problems of rising inflation. In fact, will simply add fuel to the inflation fire. I'm very concerned that the administration is not taking inflation's threat seriously, and in the case of energy prices, is enacting regulatory policies that themselves are threats. Do you agree that inflation is a serious threat to our economy, and how do you intend to address inflation?
I do think that the threat of persistently higher inflation has grown. I think my baseline expectation is still, as I mentioned, and of most forecasters, is still that inflation will move back down over the course of next year closer to our target. But clearly the risk of more persistent inflation has risen. And I think what you've seen is you've seen our policy adapt, and you'll see it continue to adapt. You know, we will use our tools to make sure that higher inflation does not become entrenched.
I noted in your opening statement that you indicated that inflation pressures will linger well into next year. You do stand by that?
Yes, I think we can now see certainly through the middle of next year. That's an expectation. You know, forecasting is not a perfect art, as you may have noticed. But yes, right into the middle of next year, and you know, that's our expectation. But of course, what's happened is that date has been pushed out repeatedly as supply side problems have not really improved.
And if Congress were to pass an additional $2 trillion plus in spending, mixed with a number of increases in taxes, would that add to inflationary pressures?
Senator, I'm sorry I'll just note that we have a longstanding policy of not commenting on active legislation, as you probably aren't surprised to hear.
I suspected that. One last very quick question, and for you, Chair Powell, you've indicated that there would be a report by the Fed on its discussion paper relating to digital currencies, and that's been delayed several times. My question to you is, when can we expect the Fed's report, and are there reasons for that delay?
I would think very soon. I mean, certainly in coming weeks. And, you know, the reasons are just trying to get it right and trying to find the time to get it right. It's been a very busy time, as you will know.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Kraft. Senator Warner, Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's good to see you, Secretary Yellen, and congratulations, Chair Powell, on your reappointment. I want to start with you, Chair Powell. I mean, I actually think the Fed's activities, particularly during the pandemic, which included both extensive use of 13.3 facilities and some aggressive bond purchases, actually helped stave off what could have been a complete economic meltdown. And while we did spend in excess of $5 trillion, mostly all in an extraordinarily bipartisan way under both President Trump and President Biden on recovery from COVID, I think history will treat those actions, certain areas, excessive. But I think net, from a historical perspective, it'll be well regarded both for the American economy and for the world's economy. But I think, as you've indicated, Chair Powell, you know, I think we're seeing our economy come back. We will differ on the bipartisan infrastructure plan and maybe even a bit of the Build Back Better, but that's part of our job. But I have seen since your FOMC's November meeting that the Fed signaled a shift, announcing starting to move back from some of the very aggressive means you've used and announcing a tapering on the pace of bond purchases month by month as the economy continues to strengthen. I'd like you to get into that a little bit. Which factors most influence that decision for a gradual change in course, and how long do you think it'll take the Fed to gradually wind down these purchases?
So we actually haven't made a decision on that, but I would just say this. The most recent data, particularly since the November FOMC meeting, show elevated inflation pressures, a rapid improvement in many labor market indicators without an accompanying addition of labor supply, and also strong spending that really signals growth, significant growth in coming months. Remember that every dollar of asset purchases actually adds accommodation to the economy. But at this point, the economy is very strong and inflationary pressures are high, and it is therefore appropriate, in my view, to consider wrapping up the taper of our asset purchases, which we actually announced at the November meeting, perhaps a few months sooner. And I expect that we will discuss that at our upcoming meeting in a couple of weeks. Of course, between now and then, we will see another labor market report, another inflation report, and we'll also get a better sense of the new COVID variant as well before we make that decision.
Well, let me drill down on that a little bit. I mean, clearly, I think I was surprised. You say you were surprised. I think most of us were surprised that coming back in September, that we didn't see more folks reenter the labor force. I believe that tapering and, frankly, accelerating it can kind of serve as an insurance policy if we don't see this return and we see these potential overheating of the economy. So I do hope that you will move more aggressively on this tapering. I also would like to just touch again, you mentioned some of the new variants with COVID. What factors, one of the things we've got to maintain is some ability to move quickly, and we obviously, Congress moved very quickly under President Trump and Secretary Mnuchin with the outset of COVID. Hopefully we won't have to come back to those kind of actions from this entity, but with these new variants coming on board, what are the markers you're going to look at to determine how that might influence Fed activity?
So at this point, I think we're all looking at the same thing, and we're listening to the experts, which are not, I'm certainly not one of those, but I talk to those people, and it's really about transmissibility. It's about the ability of the existing vaccines to address any new variant, and it's about the severity of the disease once it is contracted. And we don't know. I think we're going to know. What I'm told by experts is that we'll know quite a bit about those answers within about a month. We'll know something, though, within a week or 10 days. And then and only then can we make an assessment of what the impact would be on the economy. As I pointed out in my testimony, for now it's a risk. It's a risk to the baseline. It's not really baked into our forecast.
Well, down to my last 20-odd seconds, I'm not going to get away without at least raising an issue I always raise with Secretary Yellen, and I know Chairman Powell have raised with you as well, and that's, I think, the very smart action that took place, again, actually under President Trump, on investment in CDFIs and minority depository institutions. And I want to thank Chairman Brown and people like Senator Crapo and so many others, including Secretary Mnuchin, that we made that investment, and you now, Secretary Yellen, are implementing that. We've seen a great take-up rate from the ESIT program in terms of Tier 1 capital investment into these institutions that hit low and moderate income individuals. I guess with this demand way exceeding the amount of money we had, what else can we do to shore up these institutions? And I would love to press both of you. Maybe you can take this partially for the record since I've gone over on how we might even be able to look at securitization of some of this CDFI debt so that we can, again, increase the liquidity of these institutions. But if you briefly, recognizing I've gone over, answer that, I'd appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, we would be glad to work with you to discuss possibilities there. I think that the infusion of funds into CDFIs and MDIs, it's historic. It's going to make a tremendous difference to their ability to support businesses, particularly in minority areas. We've seen huge take-up of the ESIP funds that have been provided. It's $4 billion oversubscribed. We're working through applications, and we'll try to make decisions on investments shortly, but it certainly shows that it's a program that has the potential to make an enormous difference to this lending. We would be happy to work with you to find ways to make it yet more effective.
I'm way over time. If you could just say, yes, you'll work with me too, Chair Powell, that would be great.
Yes, I'll work with you too.
Senator Rounds from South Dakota is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, Chairman Powell, congratulations on your renomination. I do look forward to supporting your nomination. I think you've provided stability during a very challenging time. Secretary Yellen, it's good to see you once again, and I thank you for your service to our country. In September, when you were before this committee, I asked you when you would say enough is enough when it comes to our debt and deficit. You acknowledged that debt becomes an issue when it exceeds 100% of GDP, a level we have already hit, as you know, but said also that since the cost of servicing our debt has been negative due to a long stretch of low rates, our debt has been less burdensome. However, due to skyrocketing inflation, I think it's just a matter of time before we exit this very low interest rate environment. Do you think, Secretary Yellen, do you think it's finally time to start sounding some alarm bells with regard to the financing of our national debt?
Well, I wouldn't want to sound alarm bells. I think that we are in a sustainable debt path, but President Biden was very clear when he proposed the Build Back Better plan that it should be fully financed as the infrastructure bill was, and that is what CBO found, that the fiscal plans that the Biden administration have put forth in infrastructure and Build Back Better will not worsen the debt or deficit path, and indeed by the end of the 10-year horizon, Build Back Better lowers deficits, and it yields very great benefits beyond the 10-year horizon, particularly from the investment in the IRS to enhance its ability to close the tax gap and to collect revenues that are due under our tax code.
Right.
So it is a fiscally responsible plan that makes matters better rather than worse.
Madam Secretary, I guess the reason for my question is that it's not just a matter of whether or not we have $500 billion or so that'll have to be financed or more during a 10-year time period as that money comes back in for paying for programs that are 4 to 5 years in duration under the proposal. But rather, we have $29 trillion plus that will not only be refinanced during a time period, but may very well be refinanced at a higher rate. In fact, treasuries right now have run anywhere from 1.54 to 1.42% over the last couple of days, but they're going to trend upwards. And in fact, there are some people that would suggest that treasuries may very well hit 3.5% over the next 18 months. Do you think that would be a reasonable expectation?
The forecasts that were included most recently in the mid-session review assume that interest rates would move up over time over the 10-year horizon in line with the forecasts of blue chip and other private sector forecasters. And even then, given the expectation that real interest rates are likely to remain low, below levels that prevailed for much of the post-war period, for important structural reasons that we've seen plentiful savings at the global level and weak investment demand. Even with interest rates moving up, the interest burden of the debt remains quite manageable. Now, of course, there are scenarios in which interest rates could move up more than that, and we could be in a position, there's a chance, that the interest burden would become difficult for us to manage, but I believe we could have the capacity to make fiscal decisions.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. And Chairman Powell, I recognize, and you've been very consistent, that you manage based upon your direction, which is full unemployment and a 2% interest rate goal. But does the Fed take into account the impacts on on national debt servicing and our creditworthiness when it considers interest rate decisions?
I think certainly the cost of programs, it all goes into our model. We don't really see, you mentioned credit risk. There isn't any credit risk baked into treasuries at this time, and I wouldn't expect that there would be, certainly in the foreseeable future.
When you look at this, do you project that treasuries will rise over the next 18 months?
So generally, that's something that staff has been forecasting ever since I got to the Fed 10 years ago, and it really hasn't happened. What's happened is that, as the Secretary mentioned, you have a series of long-running global forces that are leading to lower sustained interest rates. How long will they last? It's very hard to say, but for now we have lower inflation trend. Obviously, currently at the moment we have high inflation, but for many years we've had low inflation, and the markets are baking in a return to lower inflation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your answers.
Senator Menendez is from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the central pillars of the House-passed version of the Build Back Better Act is an expanded child care support program that would provide direct support to families so that nobody has to pay more than 77% of their income on high-quality child care. Madam Secretary, would expanding access to child care services improve the labor force participation rate and overall economic outcomes among women?
Senator, I believe that it will succeed in having that impact. One of the reasons that labor force participation especially of women in the United States is now lower than that in many developed countries. Once upon a time, we were the leader. Now we've fallen behind. And a major difference between the United States and other developed countries is our support for childcare, paid leave, things that enable women to participate in the labor market. And so I believe the provisions, the subsidies for childcare, and the universal 2 years of pre-K, both of those things, I believe, will enhance labor force participation. There are a number of studies that show that. The Treasury Office of Economic Policy recently issued a paper that summarized some of the evidence, and recently the Congressional Budget Office, in assessing Build Back Better, issued a statement that indicated that this was likely to boost labor force participation.
Well, let me, I agree. One study suggests that the rising cost of childcare resulted in an estimated 13% decline in the employment of mothers with children under the age of 5. Another study found that one major city started offering 2 years of free public preschool. The percentage of mothers with young children participated in the labor force increased by 10%. So you have real-life realities of that. And one of the things that I'm looking forward to on this is the effect on minority families. A study from October in the Washington Post showed that black men and women are twice as likely as their white peers to report that they are unable to look for work because they can't find childcare. So there is evidence here that the currently broken childcare system is especially harmful, particularly to the most vulnerable members of our society. Chairman Powell, earlier this month I sent you a letter along with Chairman Brown and several of our Senate colleagues asking you to work closely with the Boston and Dallas Board of Directors and search committees to find and select diverse candidates for the open president's position. We haven't had a Hispanic in this role. Can you give us an update on how that search is going, including what specific steps you've taken to ensure the diverse candidates are being considered?
So those searches are just getting going now. They've, I believe, both hired headhunters, and I know the process well, and it will involve extensive outreach to all different kinds of communities and an openness to different kinds of candidates, and it's essential, we believe, that diverse candidates be identified and be given every chance to do well and win those processes as they go forward. So I can take you through the details of it if you'd like offline, but it's something we're pretty committed to.
Well, I'd very much like to see that, because as you and I have discussed on several occasions, the Federal Reserve has a serious diversity problem, particularly at the leadership level. And the lack of minority representation hurts the Fed's ability to do its job, especially when we talk about promoting maximum employment and price stability. It's essential that the Fed has in place individuals that understand how an uneven recovery will impact minority communities. So I look at this as the beginning of, I hope, an effort as it relates to diversity. And I hope we will have a successful result. I understand a process that hopefully includes good qualified candidates to be considered, but I hope it will lead to a successful result. Madam Secretary, let me turn to you on the same question. How have you empowered Janice Bowdler, the Treasury's first counselor for racial equity, to diversify the Treasury Department? This is something that I think I've raised with you several times. I'd like to understand what her first goals will be. What are the immediate goals for the Council for Racial Equity? Can you speak to me to those issues?
Yes, briefly, she's empowered to review and look for ways to enhance not only our internal hiring and diversity efforts within Treasury, but also to review all of the programs that we conduct, whether it's the emergency programs that were authorized by the ARP, or our tax code and the way it's administered more broadly. We've asked her to undertake a review of ways in which these programs can be changed, or they may have unintended negative consequences on diversity or on minority communities, and we're asking her to look for ways to improve what we do, both internally at Treasury and with respect to the many programs we conduct.
I look forward to seeing the effects of her work. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator. Senator Tillis is recognized from his office, perhaps. He may have turned his camera off. Senator Kennedy from Louisiana is recognized.
Madam Secretary, welcome. Mr. Chairman, welcome. Congratulations. Mr. Chairman, I want to start with you. I realize that no one is clairvoyant, but I think it's fair to say that the experts who have been advising you about the future rate of inflation have pretty much the same credibility as those late-night psychic hotlines you see on TV. Is the Fed considering increasing the pace of its tapering? We've got to get control of inflation. It's ravaging our people.
So I think what we missed about inflation was we didn't predict the supply side problems, and those are highly unusual and very difficult, very nonlinear, and it's really hard to predict those things. But that's really what we missed, and that's why all of the professional forecasters had much lower inflation projections. You ask about the taper, and so yes, as I mentioned earlier, since the last meeting, we've seen basically elevated inflation pressures. We've seen very strong labor market data without any improvement in labor supply. And we've seen strong spending data too. So, and remembering that every dollar of asset purchases does increase accommodation, we now look at an economy that's very strong and inflationary pressures that are high. And that means it's appropriate, I think, for us to discuss at our next meeting, which is in a couple weeks, whether it will be appropriate to wrap up our purchases a few months earlier. as I mentioned.
All right.
But in those 2 weeks, we're going to get more data, and we're going to learn more about the new variant.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, you and I don't agree on everything, but I have great respect for your intellect and your experience. And I understand you have a job to do, but I would be remiss if I didn't point out that in my opinion, there is no fair-minded person in the Milky Way who believes the infrastructure bill and the Build Back Better bill are not going to require the American people to incur substantial debt. Now, here's my question. And I'm looking for a number. How much, in the Biden administration's opinion, is too much debt? At what point, as you incur debt, will the Biden administration say, okay, that's it? We can't borrow any more, or it's going to hurt the American people?
Well, first of all, I want to say that I disagree with your assessment of Build Back Better. It is fully paid for, or even more than fully paid for, and CBO just completed a comprehensive review of it in which they found essentially the same thing. And I believe it was important that it be fully paid for. Now, I think no single metric is appropriate for evaluating whether or not the level of debt in an economy is reasonable and sustainable. And we're accustomed to looking at debt to GDP ratios and using those kind of metrics and looking around the world. Many economists have found that debt to GDP ratios of 100 or more tend to be associated with significant problems.
Are we at 100 and more?
We are,
Yeah.
but we are in very different times, and that's why it's important to recognize there's no single metric that's right. And especially in a world of very low interest rates, it's appropriate to look at
Yes,
the
ma'am.
burden of that debt on society, which is better measured by the real interest burden of the debt. And that is exceptionally low, negative currently, but projected as interest rates normalize to rise to a
I'm going to
level.
run out of time.
It's
Let
still
me
very
ask you
moderate.
this, Madam Chair, quickly. You gave a great speech back in September of 2019. It was actually an interview, and I ordered a copy at the time. And I'm trying to find my copy here. You said, this is what you said. I'm going to quote. I thought this was such a wise statement. You said, the former Fed chair said she is not worried about the debt to gross domestic product ratio in the United States right now, but added, and I quote, I'm worried about the trajectory of where it's going. It's not stable. We're not living within our means right now. Debt's going to escalate, and that's going to create problems down the road. But then most important is the demographic wave that lies ahead of us is going to essentially, over the next 30 years, double spending on 3 programs: Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid as a share of GDP. And the increases, both because of the aging population and on the healthcare side, medical expenses, those things put us on a trajectory of a completely sustainable budget path. Now, that was when the debt was 17 trillion. It's 29 trillion. You're going to add trillions more through the Build Back Better. Why is that not true today?
Well, I want to repeat again, Build Back Better is fully paid for and will not add to the debt or to deficits.
Right.
And in fact,
You and
we
I just
tend to
don't agree on
reduce
that.
it.
We
Well,
understand.
CBO certainly agrees with what I said. And I mean, we do have problems eventually in financing Medicare and Social Security, which need to be addressed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Van Hollen is recognized for 5 minutes from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank both of you for your service. Chairman Powell, congratulations on your renomination. And Secretary Yellen, I really want to pick up just where you left off. I remember 3 years ago in both this committee and the Budget Committee talking about the Republican tax breaks for big corporations. At that time, the Congressional Budget Office did assess that it would add $2 trillion to the deficit. Is that not true?
That is my recollection, that that was the kind of number they came
That
up
was the
with.
CBO score.
Yes.
So it's interesting to hear so many of my colleagues who 3 years ago didn't give a damn about adding $2 trillion to the debt, now talking about the Build Back Better bill, which, as you said, doesn't add to the debt at the end of the 10 years. In fact, the Congressional Budget Office has already done its analysis. And one of the ways that it does not add to the debt is that we close some of those big
Yes.
tax breaks for multinational corporations who like to park their profits in tax havens. And we got rid of some of the incentives in that bill that actually encourage U.S. companies to ship jobs and equipment overseas. Isn't that the case?
That is the case.
And can you talk also about your efforts, your successful efforts to establish a sort of 15%, global minimum rate in order to prevent the race to the bottom?
Yes, over decades, what we have seen is that countries have been engaged in a race to try to attract more multinational firms to do business in their countries by cutting corporate tax rates. And if you look at the pattern across the globe, you see that corporate tax rates have simply been trending down. The consequence of that is that corporations have paid less and less tax in the United States and elsewhere. They have won from this competition, and countries like the United States and other countries are raising less and less money through taxation on corporations. In the United States, corporate taxes have fallen to around 1% of GDP as a consequence of this. And this international tax agreement that's been endorsed by, I think, 137 countries have agreed to hold hands and say, enough is enough. We need to raise taxes to support infrastructure spending, to support investment in people, to make our economies productive, to grow over time. And corporations that are profitable and successful need to pay their fair share. So we want to be able to tax companies at a reasonable rate and to stop this race to the bottom. And that's what the 15% global minimum tax achieves. From our point of view, the difference, we're the only country right now that has a global minimum tax. And our tax is 10.5%. It's half what companies based that operate only in the United States or multinationals pay on their U.S. income. And that big differential really encourages multinational companies based in the U.S. to shift their profits abroad. So by raising our own rate from 10.5 to 15, we narrow that differential. We help just purely domestic firms that right now are on an unfair, unlevel playing field versus multinationals that can shift their activities abroad. And the global agreement boosts competitiveness.
Thank you,
of
Madam
American
Secretary.
firms.
I think it makes common sense, and it's important for U.S. businesses. There's also a provision in the bill that says folks who are making more than $10 million every year should pay a little bit more in U.S. taxes. I think that makes sense to most people around the country in order to help the whole country succeed. And you mentioned some of the items that we're going to then invest those funds in. It's fully paid for, including lowering child care costs, saying that no family should pay more than 8% on child care costs. That's one of the items, right?
Yes.
And there's also, as you mentioned, the provision with respect to the child tax credit. So this is one of the largest tax cuts for middle and lower income families ever, is it not? And we're talking about $3,600, up to $3,600 per year, per child, per family, which will expire on December 31st if we don't extend it as part of the Build Back Better legislation. Isn't that the case?
That is true.
So we're talking about closing corporate tax loopholes, asking folks who are making more than $10 million a year to pay a little bit more so that we can lower costs and financial squeeze on American families, and it's all paid for. Isn't that right?
That is correct.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Van Hollen. Senator Tillis is recognized.
Thank you,
North
Mr.
Carolina.
Chair. Secretary Yellen, Chair Powell, thank you for being here. Chair Powell, I'm glad to see you. Your nomination's been sent forth. I look forward to supporting your confirmation. This may actually be a legitimate yes/no question. It's on LIBOR transition. Do you all both agree that Congress needs to provide a solution to affect the LIBOR transfer, possibly using SOFR for legacy contracts, but optionality moving forward?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Chair Powell, you noted that the PCE was risen by 5% in the last year with energy and rent prices pushing inflation upward in particular. I want to make sure I understand your perspective on inflation and how it's calculated by the Fed. If the federal government provides subsidies to every American renter so their out-of-pocket rent was the same as it was 12 months ago, even though the sticker price on their rental unit has gone up, would that mean the Fed would see no inflation of rents?
I'm not sure exactly how they collect the data, but I think the question would be what is the landlord receiving? Would be my guess.
Right. So
I don't know the
if
answer
the
to your
landlord
question.
is receiving more in spite of the fact that that rent payment would have been subsidized.
I don't know the answer. I'll come back to you. I don't know the answer on that. Yeah.
Chair Powell, what would be, or I'm sorry, Secretary Yellen, what would be your position?
I would agree with Chair Powell's comments on that.
I think it'd be interesting to get that. You know, we were going to use another example. If turkey prices went up 14%, I think that's roughly the number at Thanksgiving, and we subsidize the cost of the turkey. Is the turkey cheaper, or is it 14% more expensive? So I would like for you to get back with me on that, Chair Powell. Chair Powell, I've got another question for you. We had the original COVID virus. We've had Delta. We've had some variants that have not been designated as a variant of concern. We've got the Omicron now, which is being viewed as a variant of concern. And after that, we'll have maybe a Pi variant. But I'm a bit worried that the administration has a policy of just zeroing out COVID. That the goal here is to remove a virus that's likely to be around for as long as we're alive. It's going to be like a flu season. But I feel like we're still in this mode where monetary policy or Fed policy is heavily instructed by the risk of another onslaught of a virus. We took the first wave. Now we're dealing with subsequent waves that are variants. So at what point do we just get back to a more normal execution of Fed policy that's not influenced by maybe the next threat, as if it's suggesting we're going to go back to where we were last year? I don't believe that most people think that we would treat a variant the way we had to treat this new virus that's among us. So at what point can we get away from seeing the markets, seeing the Fed appear to react based on and implement policy that looks more like what we had to do last year with something new affecting our economy?
You know, so we're not thinking, and I'm not thinking that the effects on the economy will be remotely comparable to what happened last March with the shutdowns, or that there will be additional shutdowns. We've tried to adapt. We're focused on maximum employment and price stability, and we've tried to adapt our policy as we've moved along. We'll continue to do that. And, you know, part of the world is, I agree with you, we're going to see this disease being around probably for a long time. I think the economic effects over time will diminish. We have to be humble about our ability to predict this or to really understand. But we're not at all thinking that we haven't made progress on the economy, or that, as you suggest.
Well, I think it'd be helpful for the administration to maybe be more specific to the American people to understand that COVID's going to be among us. It's a new virus. It's going to be here. We have to deal with it. We can't have talk or expectations that we would in any way react the way we did last year. Last year, rightfully, but now we have to deal with the fact that it's among us. Secretary Yellen, I'll have to, first, I'd like unanimous consent for a Washington Post fact check on the economists, the Nobel winners that President Biden has cited as the Build Back Better plan actually being non-inflationary. I think if you read further into the letter and you hear other comments by those economists, they say that longer term, it may reduce inflation, but shorter term, it may increase inflation. And so rather than drilling down on a question, my time has expired, I'd like unanimous consent to submit the fact check and just to say, Secretary Yellen, I think that there are laudable goals in some of what's put into the Build Back Better plan, but I don't think that they're sustainable. I think that the way that they've been passed out of the House are problematic, and I tend to agree with Senator Kennedy that we've got other pressing problems, promises that we've already made to the American people with respect to Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, that are promises that we've already made, that if we continue to add more and more stressors on our debt and our deficit, those are going to be promises that are broken. And then once we get that on sound footing, maybe we should consider other ways to help others.
Without objection, so ordered. Senator Warren from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So as you know, in the early 2000s, the Fed stood by and failed to use its authorities to regulate and supervise the biggest banks in this country. And the result was a financial crash that cost millions of families their jobs, millions their homes, millions their savings. That's why I believe that vigilant regulation is an essential part of the Fed's job. Chair Powell, you recently stated that it would be appropriate, quote, for a new person to come in and look at the current state of regulation and supervision and suggest appropriate changes, end quote. Is that still your position?
Yes, it is.
The press also reported this as your agreement to defer to the vice chair for supervision. So I want to ask you a specific example of how that deference would work in practice. If you're confirmed, and if the new vice chair for supervision suggests a regulatory action that you disagree with, will you bring that matter before the full Federal Reserve Board for consideration?
So let me just say that what the law does is the law gives the vice chair for supervision the authority to set the regulatory and supervisory agenda. And I would expect to have a perfectly normal, good, constructive working relationship with a new vice chair for supervision. I would not see myself as stopping those kind of proposals from reaching the board, since the law seems to indicate that that's the job of the vice chair for supervision.
Good. I'm just trying to be clear on your understanding of it. So you would bring that before the full board for consideration, even if you personally disagree?
You know, that'd be my general intent, yes.
Okay.
I mean, I can't cover every possible conceivable situation, but yes, that's my understanding of how this is the only other office that has specific legislative grant is the vice chair for supervision, and that's what the job is.
Okay, I appreciate that. So you're saying you would do it, and you would actually feel like you were legally bound to do it?
I'd say that the law, that's how I read the law.
Okay. If the vice chair for supervision recommends a regulatory action with which you disagree, such as undoing a rule that Vice Chair Quarles brought forth and that you voted in favor of it, what does it mean to defer under such circumstances? I just want to understand your thinking here.
I don't think I used the term defer. You mentioned that was a press report.
Yeah.
You know, we're a commission structure. The person is not the comptroller of the currency, where they're the sole voice. Every vice chair for supervision and those who held the job before there was a formal job, they have to convince the other members of the board, and that's how it works, and that's how I would expect it to work going forward.
And I appreciate that, but your specific language was that you would respect that authority, which is, I believe, why many in the press interpreted that as defer, and that's why I'm trying to understand what respect that authority, those were your words, means.
I would say a couple of things. First, respect the authority to bring these proposals. I also think a person who arrives nominated by the president, confirmed by this body, with particular views, I would say that person is entitled to a degree of deference, but I wouldn't overstate that. The person still will have to convince the members of the board to vote for whatever that person is proposing.
Okay, and then if I can, just one more example. If the person in this role proposed new capital requirements to incorporate banks' exposure to climate risks, would you vote for that?
Would I vote for that? I'd have to see what you're really specifically talking about.
Okay. All right. It's very helpful. I appreciate your answers here. During the last 4 years, while the Fed was chipping away at regulations piece by piece, new and emerging threats to our financial system continued to grow. I just think about the list right now. Climate change. Right now, climate change is on pace to depress the global economic output by as much as $23 trillion annually by 2050. Crypto. The market cap of cryptocurrency market is now $3 trillion, 6 times bigger than it was just a year ago. And this is explosive growth that is coupled with almost no regulation and no guardrails to protect either investors or our financial system. The crash scenario here writes itself. Non-bank financial institutions grow bigger by the day. BlackRock alone manages nearly twice as much money as the entire economy of Japan, while the Fed refuses to work to declare them a systemically significant financial institution. Growth in collateralized loan obligations, a new COVID variant, the list goes on. This is why I believe that the Fed must take a much more active role on regulation. Failure to do so puts our entire economy at risk. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Warren. Senator Haggerty of Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Toomey. I appreciate your holding the hearing today. Secretary Yellen, Chair Powell, thank you for your testimony. Chair Powell, I want to congratulate you on your recent renomination. I look forward to the hearing that's coming up. I also appreciate that we're going to be seeing the Fed's report on the digital dollar soon. We've been long awaiting that. I think it's an opportunity for America to take a real lead in innovation, so thank you for that. Secretary Yellen, I'd like to pose my first question to you. Every move that President Biden has taken so far has seemingly improved Russia and Vladimir Putin's strategic position. From capitulating on the New START treaty's unconditional extension to not fully enforcing mandatory sanctions to halt Nord Stream 2, we see Russia and Putin now with leverage and strength vis-a-vis our partners in Ukraine that they haven't had since the fall of the Soviet Union. Natural gas prices in Europe have been soaring to Putin's benefit. And now, in real time, just like watching a fatal car crash in slow motion, we're seeing Russia build up an unprecedented number of troops on the border of Ukraine. Secretary Yellen, I want to make certain that you have all the authority that you need from Congress to deter and, if necessary, to punish Putin if Russia invades Ukraine. After what happened in 2014, we certainly can't be caught flat-footed again.
We do have authority to impose sanctions. We have imposed sanctions, and the president signed I believe it was in April, a new executive order expanding Treasury's authority to impose sanctions, and we're aware of the troop buildup, and I believe have adequate authority to act at least through sanctions.
Madam Secretary, I'm pleased to hear that you have the authorities that you need to pose significant economic and financial pressure. I'm curious to hear what the Biden administration's strategy is to stop this train wreck that appears to be happening at the border of Ukraine.
Well, we're very cognizant of what's happening and are involved in discussions about what the appropriate set of steps will be.
Madam Secretary, with all due respect, I hope that we can talk much more than discussions about real strategy to send a very strong message to Putin. This is the largest buildup that we have seen, again, since the fall of the Soviet Union. They are taking a very aggressive posture there. And I would encourage you to send a strong message to Vladimir Putin that we're capable of, and you have the authority to do what you need to put significant biting financial pressure on that regime.
Agreed that that's appropriate.
Thank you. Secretary Yellen, I'll turn to another topic that we've discussed before. Back in September, we talked about the leak of confidential taxpayer information to ProPublica that was done in early 2021 for political purposes. You testified then that it's an illegal act, that it's being investigated thoroughly, and there can't be any tolerance for that. You and I agreed on that. So given that testimony, I want to ask you, have the leakers been identified?
There are independent agencies, both within Treasury, the Inspector General, also the FBI and DOJ, that are conducting investigations. We're not privy, nothing has been reported out yet from those investigations that I'm aware of, but I believe those investigations are moving forward.
Well, I take that as no update. But after the Lois Lerner scandal, after the scandal that occurred here in 2021 under this administration's watch, I appreciate the fact that there's an investigation underway, but I would say this. Until we have the results of that investigation, until we have true accountability, I cannot imagine how the Biden administration is encouraging what is in effect a 10 times increase in the audit capacity of the IRS when there's no accountability there. This is the D.C. swamp at its best.
Sir, we don't know what the source of the leak of that information was, and I would say it's premature to indicate that it came from the IRS.
Well, I think that that underscores my case. We can't even determine the source of the leak. We know that was IRS information. There's zero accountability. Again, this is the swamp,
Sir,
and I could not encourage, and certainly my constituents can't condone this aspect of the Build Back Better plan that would give even more authority and a tenfold increase in the budget to snoop on more Americans, audit more Americans, and invade our privacy. Thank you.
We have an enormous tax gap. Over the next decade, it's estimated that actual tax collections will be $7 trillion below what's due. And the IRS has been starved of resources over the last decade so that they're not able to conduct meaningful audits of either high-income individuals or complex partnerships or corporations. And that's where most of the tax gap lies. These are very important resources that are needed to make sure that the wealthiest individuals and corporations particularly comply with the tax laws and pay their fair share what's due.
I would just encourage good management here so that we make sure those resources are focused in the direction they should be rather than attacking conservative groups and ordinary Americans and leaking that information to the public. Thank you.
Senator Cortez Masto is recognized from Nevada.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Yellen, Chairman Powell, welcome. Chairman Powell, congratulations on your renomination. I also want to express my appreciation to the Treasury Department and Federal Reserve staff because we cannot forget why we're here. We have passed, over the last couple of years, several COVID relief packages that were bipartisan support, except maybe for one of them. And the money was immediately put out to help our families, our businesses. And so your staff have taken extraordinary efforts, not only to avoid an economic collapse during this deadly COVID-19 pandemic, but getting billions of dollars in relief and loans to help us manage the economy, help our small businesses, help families is a tremendous feat. And we should not forget that. So thank you to your staff who have worked so hard as well. Let me talk about something that is impacting my state, is the supply chain disruption. And I know you all are working on this. Secretary Yellen, President Biden announced a plan to address the supply chain disruptions. Now, it's clear that the low vaccination rates, repeated outbreaks, and an over-reliance on Chinese imports contributes to some delays and shortages. But Secretary Yellen, where has President Biden's initiatives to address supply chain disruptions been successful, and where are some of the current sticking points that might persist past the second half of next year?
Well, President Biden, the administration, created a supply chain disruption task force in June, and it's been working broadly to identify places where the White House could make a contribution, could be effective. And I think we're beginning to see progress at the ports. As you know, President Biden worked with the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, where there have been long delays in unloading ships waiting for many days to be able to offload their containers. They've agreed to remain open 24/7, which they're now doing. And also, the administration has worked with major retailers that were leaving containers for long periods of time on the docks without picking them up to make sure that they begin to expedite movement of those containers away from the ports. In other areas, in Savannah, the president has worked to establish locations away from the ports where containers could be brought, moved, and deposited to create more room at the docks to keep cargo moving. And so there are just a wealth of interventions and working really with private sector. These are private sector participants that are responsible for the supply chain, but bringing together parties. We're looking at ways that maybe we could work with states and cities to expedite the licensing, commercial driver's license, to raise the supply of truck drivers, which are in short supply. And of course, a lot of this is related to the pandemic, and it comes back to increasing vaccinations, boosters, get the pandemic under control so that demand patterns shift back toward more normal, toward services and away from goods. But there are a wealth of interventions that the White House is involved in.
No, I appreciate that. I think there is also a role for Congress to continue to support not only the administration, but there's legislation that we could pass to actually help us address this as well, which is why I support the Supply Chain Resiliency Act that has been introduced by me, several of my colleagues. It creates an Office of Supply Chain Resiliency at the Commerce Department charged with monitoring, researching, and addressing vulnerable supply chains. The office will provide loans, loan guarantees, and grants to small and medium manufacturers to allow them to address supply chain bottlenecks by expanding production. We should be prepared for this, knowing this has happened for the future, short-term and long-term. And so I appreciate your comments.
Long-term is important as well.
Thank you. I know my time is up. I will submit the rest of my questions to you for future response as well. Thank you again.
Thanks, Senator Cortez. Now, Senator Scott from South Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member, for holding this hearing this morning. Thank you to the guests for being here with us this morning. I was thinking about the conversation I had over Thanksgiving with some South Carolinians about the consequences of elections, and we've heard over and over again that elections have consequences. Elections have consequences. Perhaps no finer point that elections have consequences is simply losing a single seat in Georgia, January 5th. The result of one lost seat in Georgia may cost taxpayers just this year $5 trillion in additional spending. One single seat, $5 trillion in additional spending. $1.9 trillion on a COVID relief package that had 1% for vaccines and less than 9% for COVID-related health. $1.2 trillion for an infrastructure package with only 10% of that $1.2 trillion going to roads and bridges in the next 5 years. And now we're talking about overheating the economy with another $2 trillion. Elections have consequences. It's stunning And what I've heard this morning is hard to process back at home in South Carolina. What I've heard so far is that the administration wants you to believe what they say and not what you see and are experiencing, what you see with your own eyes. They say by putting another $2 trillion in the economy, it will make things more affordable for you. But what you see and are experiencing is inflation, in part caused by trillions of dollars of government spending and the anticipation of even more money. In other words, when inflation is over 6% and your wage growth is under 3%, your buying power is going down, not up. And they want you to believe that spending more money is going to solve this problem. But South Carolinians on a fixed income, like Social Security, averaging around $1,500 per month, they're spending because of this transitory inflation. I don't know what the definition of transitory is anymore. A third of their Social Security income on putting gas in their cars, heating their houses, and fixing up the places they live in. Chairman Powell, is it your impression that the Biden administration has a clear understanding that rising prices are hitting people the hardest who are on Social Security, families struggling paycheck to paycheck, and single moms?
It's not appropriate for me to comment on what the Biden administration thinks.
What do you
say that we do?
Well, let me ask you that.
I can talk about what I.
What do you think in 30 seconds or so?
So I think that's right. I think that if you think about families that are living paycheck to paycheck, they're feeling high gas prices, soon enough heating oil prices, food prices. They're certainly feeling that. And, this is our job. Our role is to make sure that this higher inflation does not become entrenched.
And part of the challenge that I see, I know that someone else may address this point, but I was trying to figure out the complexity of the labor force participation rate. And the fact of the matter is that since the pandemic, we've seen a loss of about 1.7% in the labor force participation rate. We celebrate a 4.6% unemployment rate, but what we sometimes miss is the fact that when you have fewer people looking for work, your unemployment rate goes down because your long-term unemployment goes up, which means that your labor force participation rate also goes down. Before I run out of time, let me just follow up on Senator Haggerty's points about expanding the power at the IRS and your response, Secretary Yellen. Giving the IRS more power to catch tax cheats by starting with the IRS bank reporting proposal seems far-fetched at best, because the original proposal literally said that if you were a successful lemonade stand operator making $12 a week, putting $600 into your checking or savings account, your checking account, would cause that account to be reported to the IRS. So then they revamped that proposal to $10,000, said differently, if you're making minimum wage, working almost full time, your accounts would then also be transferred or at least available for heightened inspections by the IRS. If you're looking to catch complex business partnerships in cheating their taxes, you don't need the IRS bank reporting proposal. Can you tell the American people today, Secretary Yellen, whether you still support any form of the IRS bank reporting requirements your department proposed earlier this year, which would provide the IRS with currently undisclosed taxpayer information for the purpose of targeting essentially every single working American at minimum wage or higher? Do you still support that or not?
I do support it. I think it's important that the IRS have visibility into opaque income streams, and that's an important way of improving tax compliance.
Secretary Yellen, let me ask you a question. Let me ask you a question. Reclaiming my time, let me ask you a question, because if you're looking to catch tax cheats, why in the world would we start with something as low as $600 and then revamp it to $10,000? If you're trying to find millionaires and billionaires, are not running lemonade stands. I don't think they are, and they're certainly not making minimum wage. So when you when you create a new approach to having the IRS search through our account records at our financial institutions.
I'm sorry, it is not searching through anybody's.
Compelling our financial institutions to forward our information to the IRS.
I'm sorry, it is not detailed information about what you're doing in your
Aggregated
bank
information
account.
going
It
to
is
the
too-
aggregated information going to the IRS is the scariest proposal, and there's no way that it has to be anywhere near the thresholds that you've started with in order to find a way to take accountability for those complex organizations.
Senator Scott, your time has expired. Secretary Yellen, please answer the question.
Well, Chairman, if we're going to have a conversation, we're going to have the dialogue.
Well, you've had the dialogue. Please.
We're going to have a dialogue.
We've worked carefully with Congress to narrow the scope of the reporting, and in particular to exempt wage earners and federal beneficiaries. The initial proposal was intended to be comprehensive. The requirement asked for exactly two pieces of information, aggregate inflows and aggregate outflows over the course of a year for each account where financial institutions already report interest income earned if it exceeds $10. The burden on financial institutions was minimal, and there was no attempt to target income earners whose actual incomes are below $400,000, but the low reporting requirement was meant to make evasion more difficult by opening multiple accounts.
Thank you. Senator Ossoff from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses. Chair Powell, congratulations on your renomination. The Fed, as has been noted, is beginning to taper its bond buying program, but the program is scheduled to continue through mid-next year. We're talking about approximately $100 billion in November, around $90 billion in December, according to the current schedule that we've seen, created by the Fed, injected into capital markets via asset purchases. Chair Powell, what specific economic purposes does this bond buying continue to serve?
So we are actually, at our next meeting in a couple of weeks, going to have a discussion about accelerating that taper by a few months. And in the intervening time, we'll see more data on inflation, on unemployment, and also we'll see more about the development of the Omicron variants. The purpose at the very beginning was all about market function, and it did a great job the purchases did a great job of restoring market function. When we continued the program and said we would continue it until substantial further progress was made, the idea was to continue to support the economy in the way that lower, longer-term interest rates do. And it served that purpose. Now the economy is strong, and it's strong, and inflationary pressures are high. So we're looking at going to discuss the possibility of a faster conclusion and wrap up those purchases a little earlier.
But with aggregate demand quite strong, in fact, demand currently exceeding supply of labor and durable goods in certain markets, as you noted, rates are low, capital markets are highly liquid. So what economic purpose, and I'm not disputing that there is one, but what economic purpose does this continued bond buying serve today and in the months to come, recognizing that, as you've stated, you and your colleagues will be reassessing the pace of the taper at your December meeting?
So the purpose it has been serving lately, for the most part, has just been supporting economic activity. And you're absolutely, the point I'm making is that the need for that has clearly diminished as the economy has continued to strengthen, as we've seen continued, significant inflationary pressures. And that's why that's why we announced that we would taper. And it's why we're now saying that we're going to discuss a somewhat faster taper at our next meeting.
When future crises arise, as they no doubt will, this specific method, quantitative easing, bond purchases beyond typical federal open market operations, which are targeting interest rates, what have been the costs and benefits of utilizing this technique? Does it not, for example, while it provides additional liquidity to capital markets, worsen inequality by driving up equity and asset valuations and shifting more cash onto the balance sheets of major financial institutions, high net worth individuals, and investors?
So I think the record from this and the last episode is that asset purchases work through much the same channels as regular interest rate changes. Just the difference is when you're at the effective lower bound, you can't lower interest rates anymore. What do? There are two things you can do, really. You can promise to hold rates lower for longer, and that will affect rates out the curve. And then you can actually go ahead and buy bonds directly, and that lowers long-term rates. That supports economic activity. So it's part of the toolkit. As long as we're going to be near the effective lower bound, asset purchases will be part of the toolkit. You know, the inequality point, I think it does not bear up under scrutiny. Essentially what's happening is companies are experiencing lower longer-term rates. That enables them to finance their operations. Mortgage rates, the longer-term debts in our economy will benefit from those lower long-term rates and support economic activity through many of the same channels. I think that the idea that they promote inequality is not well supported, and we never, by the way, we never hear about that from the, you know, we meet with community groups and labor unions and things. They never come in and complain about quantitative easing.
Thank you for sharing your point of view, Chair Powell. With my remaining time, I'd like to ask you what you currently assess to be the most significant systemic threats to financial stability in the United States.
You know, I would say the banking system is strong. There are some issues to address in the capital markets, but I wouldn't say they rise to the level of grave systemic importance. We always think about cyber risk as being the one that's so difficult to quantify and for which it's hard to have a great playbook. So that's the one that I tend to lose sleep over.
Thank you, Chair Powell. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Daines of Montana is recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman, thank you. Secretary Yellen, Chairman Powell, thank you for being here as well. And congratulations, Chairman Powell, on your renomination. I was vocal and out front last August supporting your renomination, and congratulations, you'll have my support. I'd like to start by expressing my concern with the inflation we're seeing in the economy. My concern with the administration and my Democrat colleagues are continuing to plow ahead with, I believe, is a very reckless tax and spending proposal as if inflation did not exist. To go back to where we were here earlier this year, Senator Scott made the comment about elections having consequences. And the consequences are then we have policy outcomes here that have consequences, even though we had nearly $1 trillion of unspent COVID relief dollars coming into 2021. The Democrats marched forward with a $1.9 trillion purely partisan spending package.